Ever since the 60s, with what is called the Jesus movement, it's popular to ask the question when faced with a dilemma of any sort, what would Jesus do? I've had that question asked of me a lot in my years as a priest. People would often ask me, Father, what would Jesus do in this situation? And I have found no matter what the situation is or who's asking the question, what the crisis or question happens to be, the answer is always the same. What would Jesus do? Well, what do you know? He'd do exactly what I do. Shazam! Who'd have thought? And perhaps all of us, one way or another, are guilty of that to a certain degree because we like to know and think that Jesus would affirm what we do. But what that does, it runs the risk of reducing our faith to two things: wishful thinking and imaginary friends. And perhaps all of us, including me, to some degree or another, are guilty of that. But it got to the point where someone once asked me, Father, what would Jesus do? And I answered, who cares? They were shocked when I said that, and I say it sincerely to you. I don't care what Jesus would do. Yes, a priest during Mass from the pulpit in a homily is saying in no uncertain terms, I don't care what Jesus would say. I care what he did say, and I care what he actually did. We see examples of this in today's gospel where someone might face that particular dilemma. It's not necessarily a bad thing to ask the question, what would Jesus do? But perhaps the best way to answer that question is with another question. What's the last thing we would want Jesus to say? What's the last thing we would want Jesus to do? And again, we see that in today's gospel. First, let's begin with what Jesus doesn't say, and in fact never says in the gospel. He never tells anyone at any time, you've made it. Good going. You're on your way. Let me correct myself. He says it once over 4 gospels. And that is to the good thief who died with him on the cross. Today you'll be with me in paradise. But consider, he was dying on the cross as well. He didn't have much life left to live to mess it up. But that's the only time Jesus ever told anyone, you've made it. He never tells that to anyone. He might say, you're not far. You're on the right track. But he never tells anyone you've made it. That's what he doesn't say. But perhaps the best way to answer the question, what would Jesus say, is to ask another question. What's the last thing we would want Jesus to say? Knowing he would never tell us to continue in sin. He would never tell us to ever commit a sin. That's a given. What's the last thing we would want Jesus to say? And here's where we have today's gospel. The rich young man. What must I do to inherit eternal life? Jesus said, you know the commandments, follow them. Well, I do. What would Jesus say to that? Well, what Jesus would say, by the standard people ask the question, would be, well, he probably would say, you're doing well, you're just fine, I'll see you in heaven, can't wait to get there. But what did Jesus in fact say? You have one thing left to do. Sell all you have and give to the poor and follow me. Perhaps the last thing a rich young man wanted to hear. Give everything away and then follow me. And of course, the story goes, he walked away unhappy. So what would Jesus say to someone perhaps he may have lost? Well, by today's standards, Jesus would say, no, come back. I didn't realize it would drive you away. Let me lighten up on that because I don't want to lose people. No. What in fact did Jesus say? He said how difficult it is for the rich to enter the kingdom of heaven. Of course, not to be outdone by a rich young man, the apostles immediately say, well, we've given up everything to follow you. What would Jesus say to that? By today's standards, he'd say, good for you, you're doing what I asked him to do, you're doing it, come follow me, let's go. But what in fact did Jesus say? You've given up everything to follow me? you will get it back 100-fold with persecutions. This group of cowards who at the first sign of trouble at the Garden of Gethsemane would all to a man abandon Jesus. He's now promising them, you will face persecutions. The last thing the apostles wanted to hear. And so we have a challenging gospel today. Jesus is not out for good publicity. He's not out to attract a crowd, but he gives us the standards we need to follow him. What must we do? Well, we're here, we're worshiping, we're receiving the Eucharist. We work every day to live that gospel in our lives. What would Jesus say to that? Well, we have the example in the gospel. Might be a frustrating answer, but some of you are familiar with the author C.S. Lewis and perhaps have read some of his works. He's a very highly admired spiritual writer. He himself had a spiritual writer that he admired greatly, a man named George MacDonald, and he quotes him on occasion. And one way he quotes George MacDonald is having said, Jesus is easy to please, but hard to satisfy. Jesus will always love us in what we do and the efforts we make to living his gospel, to building up the kingdom of heaven. But Jesus is hard to satisfy. He will always tell us, you're lacking in one thing. The question might be for all of us, what is my one thing? I'm a priest. I celebrate the Eucharist. I guess I'm on my way. Well, no, Jesus would say, no, Father Bill, you're still lacking in one thing. I wonder what that might be, and I ponder it every day. What's that one thing that Jesus would say to you? To the rich young man, the last thing he wanted to hear was that he had to sell all he had. To the apostles, the last thing they wanted to hear was that they were going to face persecutions. We know they eventually faced them, and all of them died martyrs' deaths. For all we know, the rich young man did just that, sold all he had and followed Jesus. What would Jesus say to each and every one of us? Knowing he would never tell us to continue in sin, what's the last thing we would want Jesus to say to us? And that might be a good clue in answering the question, what would Jesus say?